You are welcome to take a trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian mountain history. Tell us where you're watching this right now, because what we're about to talk about has been talked about for generations without any full answers. In the fall of 1921, the mountains of Tennessee still held secrets that time was determined to keep hidden. Anna Crowder was 32 years old and lived near Gatlinburg, a hilly area where small farms and Baptist churches brought people together. At that time, it was hard to get around in eastern Tennessee because the dirt roads wound through deep valleys and thick oak and hickory woods. Families lived far away from each other, divided by miles of rough trails and shaky wooden bridges over frozen streams. Anna was not a normal person in that country area. Thomas, her husband, died of the Spanish flu in 1918, leaving her to live alone in a log cabin high on a hill about 5 miles from the nearest town. Anna, unlike other women in the area, had a good education, could read and write well, and kept a thorough journal of what she saw in nature and in the mountains. Some of her friends admired how independent she was. Some people said that a woman who was by herself in the woods was getting too much attention. Anna began having strange guests in the summer of that year. Margaret, her older sister who lived in Sevierville, said that a guy would sometimes show up near her house at dusk. He never got close enough, but instead watched from the edge of the woods. She said that the man was tall, wore dark clothes, and wore a hat with a wide top that covered most of his face. She couldn't figure out who he was, but she had a feeling that his appearance wasn't a coincidence. She tried to get her sister to leave the cabin and move in with her in the city. Anna said no. She said that Thomas had worked the land for years and that she wouldn't leave it all for a stranger who might just be a lost hunter. But the fear was there. It was written down in the pages of her journal with handwriting that was getting worse. Anna wrote in a September post that she had heard footsteps around the house early in the morning and found footprints in the mud near the bedroom window in the morning. Men who wanted to live outside the law, bootleggers of illegal booze, fugitives from other states, and men who would hide in the deep valleys and only come out when they needed supplies were known to live in the Appalachians. Since January 1920, when alcohol was officially banned, those mountains were turned into a maze of hidden distilleries and secret paths. People who lived alone and were cut off from others could be in danger, especially if they took the wrong road. Anna did not show up to the Gatlinburg Baptist Church on October 23, 1921, for Sunday church. This got everyone's attention right away because she was a regular and almost never missed. Margaret was scared, so she asked 2 guys from the congregation to check out the house by going there. What they found that cold fall afternoon was the start of one of Tennessee's biggest secrets. The door to the house was stuck. Everything inside looked like it had been violently turned over. Things were flipped over. There were pieces of broken china on the kitchen floor. There were clothes all over the rooms. She was gone, though. That little book she kept on a table next to the fireplace was gone. Thomas's framed photos and a few holy items were the only things that were still whole, stayed carefully put away on a shelf, as if the person who broke into the house knew exactly what they were looking for and had a weird respect for religious symbols. The guys called Anna's name all over the property as they went outside. The mountains were so quiet that they could only hear their own voices. As soon as word got around town, a search party was put together. About 15 men, some with hunting dogs, searched the well-known tracks, streams, and caves in the area. Only one thing they found was scary. Anna always wore that woolen shawl that time of year. It was lying about 300 yards from the house, next to an old oak tree with lightning holes in it. This piece was torn and hanging from a low tree. It looked like it was ripped off during a fight, or a last-ditch effort to get away. The search went on for 5 days in a row. Men from nearby counties joined the search and went through every valley, canyon, and forgotten mountain track. A man named Edmund Hartley, who was the sheriff of Sevilla County, led the probe himself. Hartley was known for all of his. Even though he was an expert in tough cases, he admitted that he was faced with something that made no sense. It wasn't nice outside. In October, it rained a lot in the Appalachians, making the tracks slippery with mud and the streams overflowing with cold mountain water. In the morning, thick fog covered the slopes and made it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. There were men in the search group who were thinking about giving up. They said that in this maze of forests, they would never find Anna if she had run away on her own or been taken by someone else. And Hills, Margaret Crowder, didn't think this was possible. She told the sheriff that her sister would never leave everything without warning, so he had to keep looking into it. Margaret brought the diary that Anna had shown her months before. It was an older notebook that had notes about the strange person who was walking around the property. Hartley carefully looked over the pages. The details were not clear, but they were all the same. He was always outside at dusk and watched from afar. Hannah said he seemed to know her habits and knew when she went to the stream to get water or to take care of the garden behind the house. The sheriff started to question the people in the area. At that time, there were about 500 people living in Gatlinburg, and everyone knew each other, at least by sight. But there were many more people in the mountains nearby. There were lonely men living in cabins that were even farther away from everything else. Seasonal workers who came to work on the farms and then left, and drifters who followed the trains to find work. How to spot a stranger in a dark hat. That, with so many new faces, it was almost impossible. Eventually, a witness came forward. About 3 miles away from Anna's land, a farmer named Caleb Morrison said he saw something strange on the night of October 22nd, the day before she went missing. He saw a lamplight moving through the woods off the beaten road on his way back from delivering milk in Gatlinburg. Morrison thought it was odd that no one walked in that area at night. The ground was dangerous because there were uncovered roots and sharp drops. Because he was tired and needed to get home before it rained, he didn't look into it. He asked Morrison to show him the exact place where he saw the light. They walked along a narrow path that went through pine trees and rancherias until they got to a spot where thick moss and dead leaves covered the ground. There, they found signs of a recent camp. Someone made a small fire and put stones in a circle around it to protect it. Men's boot prints were deep enough around it to show that. The person had a lot of weight on their shoulders. The most unsettling thing about this makeshift camp was where it was set up. You could see Anna's cabin clearly, even though it was far away, and you would need to know the area well to see it. The sheriff picked up some things that were left at the spot. A Red Man tobacco tin that was empty, pieces of hemp rope, and something that made her stomach turn. A piece of blue fabric that Margaret knew right away was from Anna's dress was found. She was last seen at church on Sunday. There were spots on the fabric that looked like they were torn with force. The information started to show a bad picture. Anna had been being watched for weeks or even months. This person knew her habits, knew when she was by herself, and was ready to wait for the right time. It didn't look like a normal theft when someone broke into the house. Some valuable things, like Thomas's silver pocket watch and cash hidden in a biscuit tin, were not touched. The person who broke in was looking for a certain person or thing. Hartley broadened the search to include areas other than the nearby mountains. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties giving details about Anna and asking them if they had seen a woman who looked like her. All of the answers were negative. He also looked into the records of known secret breweries in the area. I thought Anna might have seen something about smuggling booze and caused trouble for someone, but she hadn't. When a real link was found, Margaret offered a $50 prize, which was a lot of money at the time, for any information that led to her sister's location. In Gatlinburg, Sevierville, and Pigeon Forge, Posters were put up. As it was told from person to person, the story became more and more scary as it went through the mountains. Some said that pirates had taken Anna and didn't want anyone to see. Others talked about a mountain man, a dangerous recluse who lived in caves and attacked people who came out of them, went too deep into the woods. Some people even talked about curses from the Cherokee, who used to live on these sites but were forced to leave decades ago. Early in the year 1921, winter came. By the middle of November, snow started to cover the mountaintops in the Appalachians, and at night the temperature dropped below freezing. The final end of the search for Anna Crowder. Sheriff Hartley didn't have the tools or people to keep searching the icy mountains. Margaret was told about the case, would stay open, but that the chances of finding her sister living were getting lower every day. It was locked and sealed in Anna's house. Margaret could not go inside because she felt a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She paid a lawyer in Knoxville to take care of the property's legal issues, but she wouldn't sell or leave the house for good. She still thought Anna might come back. She thought Anna would show up one day walking along the trail with an impossible reason for everything. But living in the hills, kept going at the same speed. Families stocked up on groceries and firewood to get ready for the harsh winter. As time went on, talk about Anna's absence gave way to more pressing issues. Margaret and a few close friends were the only ones who kept the memory alive. They got together every once in a while to pray and talk about what they thought might have happened. During this time of what seemed like quiet, something very strange happened. A shooter named Isaiah Brennan was after a deer in January 1922 in. He was in the woods north of Gatlinburg when he saw a cave that he was sure he had never seen before. Brennan had hunted in that area for decades and knew it like the back of his hand, but he had never seen this small entrance before. It was partly hidden by a curtain of frozen ivy and rocks that had fallen. Brennan lit a fake torch and went inside because he was interested. It turned out that the cave was deeper than it looked. He went down a short path that led to a natural room about the size of a small barn. The air inside was damp and smelled funny, like wet earth mixed with something Brennan couldn't put his finger on right away. His blood ran cold when he raised the torch to light up the room better. There were clear signs that people had recently been in the cave. In one area, there was a pile of old blankets, rusty, empty food cans, and the remains of campfires that had not been lit. But Brennan ran back to town because of the personal items that were all over the floor. Clothes for women were torn and dirty with mud. He knew right away that the brown leather boots were the style that women in the area wear. A simple silver necklace with a cross that looked exactly like the one Anna Crowder always wore was hanging from a natural ledge in the rock. It looked like it had been put there on purpose. Sheriff Hartley was told right away. He got some guys together and followed Brennan back to the cave. It was even scarier when daylight came in through the door and showed what they saw. Besides the things that have already been stated, deep scratches in the stone on the cave walls looked like someone had tried very hard to dig or hold on. There were also pieces of wires tied to stalactites, which made it look like someone had been held there against their will. Margaret was asked to help figure out what the things were. Anna's late husband Thomas gave her the necklace as a gift for their wedding anniversary, so she was sure it was hers. Also, the clothes looked like what Anna would normally wear, but her body wasn't in the cave. There were not any. There are no remains and no clear sign of what happened to her. There are only the eerie signs that she had been there, probably living for a while after she went missing. Hartley planned an even more thorough search of the cave. They looked on every path, in every gorge, and everywhere else a body might have been left or hidden. The sniffer dogs were sent out again, but this time they followed tracks that led them around and around in the mountains. About a half-kilometer from the cave, the dogs stopped and started digging quickly in a spot of ground that looked like it had been moved not long ago. The men picked up tools and dug slowly. They didn't find dead bodies, but they did find something just as upsetting. Anna's lost book was buried not very deep. Even though the leather-bound notebook was wet and damaged, many of the pages could still be read. Hartley took it to his office as proof and spent the whole night reading everything Anna had written down in the months before she went missing. Anna's growing up was shown by her last diary notes. Fright. In September, she wrote that the guy in the dark hat was showing up in her nightmares over and over again. By October, her writing was more broken up and urgent. Anna said she woke up to knocks on her door early in the morning and found her personal items moved around. She also said she always felt like she was being watched, even when she was in her own home. Anna wrote something in her last note, which was dated October 22nd and was made the day before she disappeared. It made Hartley feel cold. He's becoming more brave. He left something on the porch today. A wild flower came up. I believe it's a message. I've run out of ideas for what to do. Even though I prayed all night, I still feel scared. Let Margaret know if anything bad happens to me that I tried to stay strong. Anna's diary became the most important part of the probe. Hartley looked over every page for days, hoping to find signs that would help him figure out who the mysterious man was. Anna had never been able to get a good look at his face, though, and his words stuck with her. Clearly not clear enough. He was tall, had broad shoulders, moved slowly, and always wore that hat with the wide top. He might have been any of a dozen mountain guys. The sheriff chose a different course of action. He started to look into crimes that had happened in the area in the past that were similar. He went to the dusty county archives and looked through old files to find cases of women who had gone missing or been abused. What he found made the puzzle even more complicated. In 1918, a woman named. In Blount County, which is about 40 miles west of Gatlinburg, Ruth Patterson also went missing for similar reasons. Ruth, who was also a widow, lived alone on a property that was far away from everything else. She had told her friends that she felt watched in the weeks before she went missing. No one ever found her. In the end, the case was thrown out because it might have been a mountain accident or a willing escape. In 1916, 2 years before, there was the case of Elizabeth Morrow in County. Elizabeth was 34 years old and lived alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere with an old maid. She left after telling the local minister that a strange man had come onto her land and asked for water, but something about his eyes scared her very much. The next morning, when the maid woke up, Elizabeth wasn't there. There were signs of a fight in her room. She was also never found. Almost didn't notice a design coming out of the shadows. 3 women, all widowed or single and living alone in rural and remote parts of East Tennessee, went missing after saying they saw a strange man. The cases were spread out over long periods of time and space, which made it hard to make a clear link, but the parallels were too strong to be just a coincidence. The sheriff called his co-workers in other counties. They started to share and compare information with each other. The sheriff of Blount County said that a guy living alone in the mountains had been briefly looked into after Ruth Patterson went missing. Silas Garrick was his name, and he was regarded as a loner who sometimes. He cut down trees and caught furs for a living. People knew Garrick for having a short fuse and avoiding people, but when he was asked about it at the time, he had a story. He was at a mining camp many miles away when Ruth didn't show up. The name Silas Garrick started to come up in other talks. In the fall of 1921, some Gatlinburg locals said they saw a man who looked a lot like him near the village. He paid for things at the shop with old silver coins and didn't say anything when he left. Word. The creep remembered Garrick because he always wore a dark felt hat low over his eyes and had a very disturbing look in his eyes. Hartley chose to look for Silas Garrick, but it was harder than he thought. Gary didn't have a fixed home. He was always moving through the mountains, making temporary camps in caves and old houses that no one was using. Some people said he knew the Appalachians better than anyone else, and that he could spend months alone in the woods and still be safe, based only on what he caught and hunted. One of the informants finally gave a good tip in March 1922. A fur seller who worked with mountain men who lived alone said that he had bought furs from Garrick a few weeks before, and that he had told him that he was camping near the Little Pigeon River in Crow Run, a deep canyon north of Gatlinburg that no one could get to. Hartley got together a group of 6 expert trackers and planned an adventure. They left at dawn, following paths that got narrower as they went, until they were no longer there. It was true to its name, Raven's Gap, a deep cut in the mountain with rock walls more than 50 meters high. It had a fast, icy river running through it at the bottom. There, the sun rarely touched the ground, so there was always a humid twilight in the air. It took them almost a whole day to find evidence that people had been there. Footprints on the bank of the river, the remains of a recent fire, and cleaned and stacked animal bones in a strange way. They followed the tracks to a smaller cave that was hidden behind a group of broken rocks. Hartley told them to be quiet. They walked up slowly, drawing their guns. When they went into the cave, it was empty, but what they saw inside made their worst fears come true. It was clear that it was the home of someone who had nothing to do with society. There were piles of animal skins, simple tools, and stolen or bought grain from unknown sources, and names were scratched into the stone on one wall of the cave with something sharp. Anna, Ruth, and Elizabeth. 3 women's names are carved into prizes that look like the letters A, K, and D, should protect. When the names were found, carved into the cave wall, they sent shock waves through the probe. Hartley told his men to keep the area safe and not touch anything until he had time to write down everything that happened. They looked through that dark house for hours, making a list of every item, mark, and piece of evidence that might link Silas Garrick to the disappearances. Besides the names on the wall, they also found other things that were scary. A rough wooden box held hair of different shades and types that are held together with a thin string. There were also pieces of different fabrics and dresses that looked like they had been cut up and saved on purpose. Under a pile of blankets, a diary that wasn't Anna's was found. It was written in rough, hard-to-read handwriting, and was full of jumbled thoughts about being alone, being rejected, and being angry at the world. Hartley took a seat at the gap in the cave wall and started to read the disturbing journal. The entries were not always written, but it was clear that they went on for a while. Silas Garrick wrote about his hard youth in the mountains of Virginia. He talked about having a father who abused him and a mother who left him when he was only 8 years old. He talked about years of traveling alone, being turned away from towns and growing hate for any kind of civilization or social order. But the newer parts were what really made my blood run cold. Garrick wrote that he watched women from afar, studying how they moved and what they did. Habits. He said it was like hunting, like these women were wild animals that had to be carefully followed. Some parts were about Ruth Patterson. He first saw her getting water from a stream and decided she would be his friend, even if she didn't want to be. He wrote about Elizabeth Morrow with a mix of interest and anger, noting that she had screamed when he finally got close. Then there was Anna, a huge number of pages about Anna Crowder. Garrick said this about her. Not the same as the others, stronger and more motivated. He thought it was great that she lived alone and didn't seem scared. One thing that was darker than respect was the way it was felt. He wrote that he wanted to break her strength and show her that she wasn't as strong as she thought. Later entries about Anna were broken up and hard to understand, which made it seem like something went wrong with his plans, and she fought in ways he hadn't expected. He read, and one of his guys made. Still another find. It was hidden in a deep crack in the rock at the back of the cave. There were personal items from all three women inside, including a wedding ring that Margaret would later figure out belonged to Anna, a silver brooch that Ruth Patterson's family knew belonged to her, and a pair of tiny glasses that Elizabeth Morrow had owned. Each thing was silent proof of lives that were cut short, and stories that would never have a normal ending. Silas Garrick wasn't there, though. The fire. It had been cold for at least 3 days. He was gone, and we had no idea when he would come back. Hartley put 2 men on guard duty in the cave. They were hidden in key spots and were told to arrest Garrick if he came out. The others went back to Gatlinburg to plan a bigger search. There were telegrams sent to every county in East Tennessee and states nearby. Posters were passed out that talked about Silas Garrick. There was a $100 reward for information that led to his arrest. The word got around quickly. Newsprints in Knoxville and even Nashville wrote about the case and called Garrick the ghost of the Appalachians, and blamed him for the missing of innocent women in the mountains. That report made Margaret Crowder cry as she read it. On the one hand, she felt some comfort that the investigation was moving forward, and that they now had a name and a face for the nightmare that had been her life for months. However, Anna's disappearance stayed the same, without a doubt. Margaret was in a lot of pain because Garrick was on the run, and the only person who could answer her question was him. What had really happened to her sister? Was she still alive somewhere, locked up in another secret cave? Or had that October night sealed her fate? It's been weeks now and still no news about Garrick. In the Appalachians, spring came early, clearing the snow and making the streams roar with water. The mountain sides turned bright pink with wildflowers, and life went back to its endless circle. But in the Middle Tennessee, in many places, a persistent fear had taken hold. Women who lived alone started being more careful to lock their windows and doors. Neighbors set up guards every night. People whispered Silas Garrick's name with the same fear that people have for ghosts and monsters in old stories. In May 1922, something unexpected happened that gave the investigation a new boost. A traveling pastor who preached in camps and small churches across the mountains showed up at Sheriff Hartley's office. The man who said his name was. Reverend Joshua Abernathy said he knew something about Silas Garrick. He had met Garrick many years before when he was trying to spread religious gospel to some mountain people who lived alone. Reverend Joshua Abernathy was a thin man who was about 50 years old. He had graying hair and rough hands from working hard all his life. He sat down in the wooden chair across from Hartley's desk and began to talk in a steady but tired voice. He said he met Silas Garrick in 1914 while being lost in the middle of nowhere. People in the mountains of East Tennessee carried Bibles and prayed with anyone who would listen. Anathy found Garrick in a cabin that had been left empty near the border with North Carolina. At that time, Garrick looked like he had been on the edges of society for a long time. His clothes had a lot of patches on them. There were broken and dirty nails on his hands, and he always had an old rifle with him. The Reverend tried to talk to Garrick about salvation and community, but he was rude and didn't trust him. He had made it clear that he didn't want anything to do with preachers, churches, or anything else that smelled like civilization. Garrick did say something that stuck with Abernathy during that short, tense talk. He said that the mountains had caves so deep and out of the way that no one would ever find them. He said that someone could live there for decades without being found. When Garrick spoke, he had a strange look in his eyes, as if he was hiding something that made him feel terrible pride. When the Reverend felt threatened by the energy of the man had quickly left that area and never came back. Hartley paid close attention and asked Abernathy to take them back to that spot. Reverend thought for a moment. It had been 8 years, and the mountains were always changing. There were landslides, trees that had fallen, and paths that were being covered by bushes. He did say he could try, though. He could remember landscapes well and thought he could find some natural points that would help him find his way back. Hartley set up a new trip the next day. At that time, he took 8 men with him. They were all armed and ready for a long, hard trip. Abernathy led them along narrow paths that wound around hills and over frozen streams that not many people knew about. They walked for 3 days and camped out during the cool spring nights, making sure the fires were small so they wouldn't draw notice to themselves. The area Anathy was taking them to was even farther away than Raven Run. In those days, it was mostly wild land in a hilly area close to what is now Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Only a few stubborn residents and a lot of animals lived there. It was a steep mountain range covered in thick woods of fir and rhododendron that kept the sun out even during the day. In the afternoon of the 3rd day, Abernathy stopped at a place where 3 streams met and formed a small creek. He showed a steep hill covered in plants. He said the cabin where he found Garrick was past that hill, in a small valley between 2 mountains that was protected. The men started to climb, but it was hard for them. Don't let go of roots and twigs because the ground is wet. They finally got to the top and looked down into the valley. The cabin was right where Abernathy had said it would be. The building was made of rough-hewn logs and had a bark roof that was clearly leaky. A simple chimney made of stacked stones slowly let out smoke. There was someone inside. Hartley put his men in different places around the cabin. Making use of the trees for cover, they went down quietly. When they were 50 yards away, Hartley yelled, "Get away!" He said he was the sheriff and told everyone inside to come out with their hands showing. There was silence for a long time. The door to the cabin slowly opened. Not everyone had the same idea of what Silas Garrick looked like when he came out. He was tall, but he was so thin that it looked like he was made of bone. His hair fell over his shoulders in dirty strands, and his beard was long and twisted. He wore clothes that looked like they had been sewn together so many times it was impossible to tell what color the fabric was originally, but it was his eyes that caught my eye. The eyes looked like they were looking through people instead of at them. They didn't seem to be feeling anything. Garrick didn't try to run away or fight back. He did nothing but stand in front of the shack and watch the armed men surround him. Hartley slowly walked up to her, his gun still drawn. He told Garrick who he was again and that he was being held on suspicion of kidnapping and being involved in the missing of 3 women. Garrick didn't answer. He just kept staring as if the sheriff's words didn't mean anything. Some guys put Garrick in handcuffs while others searched the cabin. It was both less and more than what they thought it would be. The cabin was pretty much empty. A makeshift cot, a fire in the middle of the only room, some simple tools, and not much food were there. But there were more mementos of the missing women in one area, carefully placed on a piece of wood that was used as a shelf. A tortoise shell comb that Margaret would later figure out belonged to Anna, a silk handkerchief with letters that matched Ruth Patterson's, and a small Bible bound in leather with Elizabeth Morrow's name engraved on the first page. Each item was clean and well taken care of, as if the people who took care of them thought they were priceless treasures. A disturbing difference existed between the filth and squalor of the cabin and the care with which these things were stored. Hartley tried to question Garrick right then and there before they set out on the long trip back. He talked about Anna, Ruth, and Elizabeth in a clear way. Where did they go? How did they get there? There was no sound from Garrick at all. It wasn't angry or defensive. There was no reaction at all, as if he had cut himself off from everything going on around him. Reverend Abernathy looked at the scene and said in a low voice that Garrick seemed to have lost some of his humanity in those years. Mountain ranges. It took 4 days to get back to Gatlinburg because Garrick had to be watched all the time, and the rough terrain made it hard to move quickly. At any point during this, Garrick didn't say a word. He didn't complain about what he was given, slept when he was allowed to, and walked when he was told to, but he didn't show any feeling or awareness of what was going on. There were already a lot of people waiting for them when they got to Gatlinburg. Quickly, word got around that they had been caught. People crowded the streets because they wanted to see the man who had caused so much fear. Some people yelled curses, while others called for justice right away. Hartley had to tell his men to put up a wall to keep the angry crowd from getting to Garrick while they took him to the small cell behind his office. Margaret was one of the many people. She felt something snap inside her when she saw Garrick leave. Was this weak, quiet man to blame for her sister going missing? It was hard to make sense of the monster's picture. In her mind, the thin, empty figure stumbled around handcuffed between the guards. She yelled Anna's name and asked where her sister was. Garrick did not do anything. When he looked at Margaret, his eyes didn't show the least bit of recognition or regret. It took a few days for district attorneys from Knoxville to fly in and decide what to do next with the case. The issue was tricky. They had strong hints, like the women's personal items and the names carved into. That there were no bodies in the cave or in the disturbing diary. They didn't say anything. Among them was a suspect who wouldn't say anything and seemed to have shut himself off in some mental space where justice could not reach him. Gatlinburg was so caught up in the silent play that it took place in the small cell at the back of Sheriff Hartley's office. Silas Garrick sat on the small cot and stared at the stone wall as if it held secrets that only he could see. There was silence, and he didn't answer any questions. Hardly ever blink. The guards who watched him in shifts said to each other that it was like watching a statue instead of a person. During the first week, Margaret went to the cell 3 times. Every visit was a new form of pain. She begged people outside the bars to tell her something about Anna. It made her wonder where her sister was, if she was still alive in the woods, and if she had been hurt. He didn't look at her at all. It looked like his eyes were fixed on something far away, like Margaret didn't exist. Words were just noisy background noise that didn't matter. The district attorney, William Ashwood, who was very experienced, came from Knoxville with 2 helpers and suitcases full of court papers. Ashwood was known for not giving up when things got tough, but even he agreed that he was up against a problem that had never been seen before. How to bring charges against someone who refused to help with his own defense. What to do when there are no bodies to show that someone killed someone. There were some parts of Tennessee law that were very clear, but others were not so clear. Ashford spent days going over all the proof that he had gathered. He got experts from outside the area to look at the things that were found in the caves and the house. A handwriting expert in Nashville confirmed that the disturbing diary found in Raven's Gap was written in the same handwriting as old papers signed by Silas Garrick, such as a 1913 record of a fur purchase. After checking out Garrick, the doctor said that he was physically healthy, but might be mentally dissociated because he had been living alone for so long. In the meantime, Reverend Athie stayed in Gatlinburg because she felt responsible for leading the guys to Garrick. He went to the cell often, but not to question the prisoners, but to pray. Athie thought that this broken man still had a human soul somewhere inside him, and that the Holy Word might be able to reach it. He read out loud Bible passages that talked about forgiveness, redemption, and how important it was to admit your mistakes before it was too late. If Garrick heard it all, he did so in silence. At one of these prayer meetings in June, when it was hot and sticky, afternoon, something very strange took place. At that very moment, Garrick moved. Abernathy was reading the 23rd Psalm, which is about going through the valley of the shadow of death. He turned his head and looked straight at the preacher for the first time in weeks. He spoke with his mouth, and Abernathy had to lean in to hear. "They're still in the mountains," Garrick said in a faint voice. Abernathy felt his heart beat faster. "They've always been there. The mountains hold everything. Race." He called Sheriff Hartley right away. The sheriff showed up, and Garrick was back to being quiet, but Abernathy repeated exactly what he had heard. Hartley tried to get Garrick to talk again, but he didn't answer. Still, those few words made everything different. They proved what everyone thought, but they also gave some, albeit unclear, direction. Hartley set up new search trips that went to even more remote places. They looked in caves that had not been explored before, went down into deep gorges, and they looked into every rock feature that could hide something. Work that went on all summer in 1922 was very hard and tiring. A lot of people volunteered, either because they wanted the prize or because they were morbidly interested in the missing women. Others just wanted to help the families of the women who went missing. In August, something shocking was found that shook the whole area. A group of searchers was looking around in the limestone cliffs northeast of Gatlinburg when they came across a very narrow cave opening that a grown man had to crawl through on his face. It was like a small church, and it was on the other side of the narrow opening. The men ran away right away because the air inside was heavy, musty, and smelled bad. They saw what the place really was when they came back with real lanterns and cloths over their faces and mouths. A grave. Laying next to each other on the cave floor were 3 sets of bones. Old blankets and flat stones were used to carefully cover each set. It was clear that whoever put them there had tried to keep them safe, even after months or years. Their honor. They had their hands crossed over their bodies, and little dried wildflowers were all over the place. Hartley was called right away. He went into the cave with a local doctor and started the careful process of writing down information about the bodies and figuring out who they belonged to. The bodies were still partly covered in clothes that were breaking down, but preliminary identifications could be made through them. Things that were personal proved what everyone already knew in their hearts. It was found that Ruth Patterson, Elizabeth Morrow, and Anna Crowder were alive. Margaret knew about it before word got out. She fell into Hartley's arms and started to cry, feeling both incredibly relieved and sad all at the same time. At least now we knew for sure. Anna was no longer lost in the woods, where she was probably suffering in a prison in which there was no way out. She knew her sister was dead and that they would never see or hear her voice or smile again, and that hurt too much for time to heal. The doctor looked at the body parts as carefully as he or she could under the circumstances. In the end, he said "thee." 3 women had died in ways that didn't leave clear marks on their bones. There were no broken bones or other damage to the body that would suggest a fierce fight. He told Hartley in a whisper that he thought they had probably died of cold, dehydration, or even fear and shock from being locked up. After all that time, it was hard to be sure, but it looked like Garrick had taken them to those caves and held them there until they were dead. The news of the finding changed. Gatlinburg's mood went from pain to anger. People wanted justice right away. Some of the more angry men said they were going to get together and drag Garrick out of his cell and hang him from the nearby tree. Hartley had to put up 2 extra guards around his office and use strong threats of arrest to stop anyone who tried to break the law. When Garrick heard that the bodies had been found, he did something that no one expected. His beard made tears start to fall quietly down his face. He didn't cry or make a sound, but the tears kept coming as he rocked back and forth slowly on the cot. The Reverend Abernathy, who was there, tried to figure out what it meant by saying that it was sorrow, but Hartley wasn't sure. It's possible that Garrick was crying because he felt bad about losing something that, in his crazy mind, he thought was his. It was October 1922, exactly 1 year after Anna Crowder went missing, when the trial for Silas Garrick started. It was too crowded in the Sevier County Jail. People came from nearby counties just to see the man, who had made the mountains scared. The most important case in Judge Harold Peaton's 63-year career took place. He is known for being strict and fair. William Ashford, the prosecutor, made his case with an amazing level of detail. As proof, he showed everything that was found in the caves and in Garrick's house. He showed pictures of the names that were cut into the stone walls. He read parts of Garrick's upsetting diary, being careful not to include parts that might be too graphic. Picture. He asked people who had seen Garrick near the homes of the missing women to come forward. He showed evidence from Reverend Abernathy, the fur dealer, and the men who helped with the search. Margaret Crowder was one of the most convincing witnesses. Her voice was shaking, but she was determined as she talked about her sister. Anna was a strong, independent woman who deserved to live a lot longer, she said. She talked about how scary it was to not know what had happened for months and how painful it was every day not knowing. Replies. Ashford showed Margaret the crucifix necklace that was found in the first cave. Margaret put it to her chest and cried in front of the judges. Thomas Welch, a young lawyer who had just graduated from college, was chosen by the court to defend Garrick. He clearly didn't want the case, but he had to do it because it was his job. Welch tried to say that the proof wasn't solid and that the fact that personal items were found didn't prove for sure that Garrick did the wrong things. He said that Garrick might have found those things left behind in the woods, and that the fact that he was alone and strange didn't mean that he was a killer. Welch's best case, though, was about his client's mental health. He called the doctor who had checked up on Garrick to speak about how dissociated he was. He said that Garrick's years of being completely alone had made it impossible for him to know right from wrong, and that he lived in a distorted world where normal ideas of right and wrong did not apply. Welch asked that Garrick be sent to a mental hospital, instead of being put to death if he was found guilty. During the whole hearing, Garrick sat at the defense table and didn't say a word. He wore clean clothes that the court gave him, so he still looked weird, like a wild animal that was dressed as a person. His eyes kept moving around the courtroom and never fixed on one thing. He didn't answer when Judge Peaton asked him straight if he had anything to say in his own defense. It was just stared into space some more. There were 6 days of the trial. 12 local guys made up the jury. They deliberated for less than 3 hours before making their decision. 3 counts of murder found guilty. There were cheers and yells coming from everyone in the courtroom. Judge Peaton had to bang his gavel a lot to get things back in order. The sentencing part started right away. Ashford made a case for putting people to death. He said that Garrick's acts were planned, deliberate, and repeated. He had been after those women like beasts, that he had slaved them until they died, and that anyone who happened to cross his path was always in danger. Welch asked for mercy, saying that his client was mentally sick, and that putting him to death would be like putting someone to death who barely understood what he had done. It took Judge Peaton all night to make up his mind. When he came back to court the next morning, he looked very serious. Because of the nature of the crimes and the risk, he said. Because Silas Garrick was a threat to society, he would be hanged to death. The death sentence would happen at the state jail in Nashville in January 1923. Garrick did not answer the question. He moved quietly and without protesting when the guards picked him up to take him back to his cell. Margaret watched from her place and didn't feel very happy about what she saw. By the law, justice had been done, but Anna was still dead. Mary and Ruth were too. Neither could be brought to justice by a punishment. Come back. The months that followed were tense ones of waiting. Garrick was sent to Nashville and put in a secret cell until he was put to death. Reverend Abernathy asked for permission to visit him often because he still thought he could connect with the man's soul before it was too late. It was okay with the police because nobody else wanted to be near Garrick. While Garrick was there, Abernathy kept trying to get him to talk about the crimes. Not because he was morbidly interested, but because he thought. For spiritual redemption to be possible, repentance was necessary. With a soft voice, he asked Garrick what had happened to each woman, hoping that the information would help make things better between the families. But Garrick didn't say a word. He only spoke in broken words that didn't quite make sense. During a very memorable stay in December, Garrick could finally put together a few sentences that made sense. He said it was possible to live in the woods for decades without hearing a sound, a voice of a person besides his own. When he finally saw someone, especially a woman who made him think of a time when he still had family, he said that. He broke in some way, he wouldn't let them go. He was never going to be by himself again. After that, he took them to his cave so they could stay with him and be his company. Abernathy asked what happened when they didn't give in. It became clear that they wouldn't stay on their own. Garrick slowly shook his head and said, "The mountains chose," and left them in the caves with food and water. He came back days later to check on them. They were alive and dead at different times. He seemed to say this without feeling anything, like he was talking about the weather or how things grow. In the remote world where he had lived for so long, it seemed like it was just the way things were. Abernathy wrote down that part of the statement and gave it to the police. In a way, it made what everyone already knew even more clear. It's even more scary. For the most part, Garrick wasn't a killer. He was more like a natural force that had been tainted. He was a man who had been so far away from other people for so long that he had forgotten how people should treat each other. Tennessee's winter of 1922 came on with an unusually harsh blow. Storms brought snow to Nashville, covering the city with a white blanket that made the wounds of the past year look like they were not there. Behind bars in the state jail, Silas Garrick was waiting. He was locked up in a cold, damp cell away from the other prisoners for safety reasons. The police were afraid that someone would try to do justice on their own before the legal execution could happen. Margaret Crowder could not feel anything during those months. The funeral for Anna took place in a small graveyard outside of Gatlinburg. It was a simple but very moving service. Dozens of people came, and many of them were strangers to Margaret. But they were all moved by the sad story that had been going around. Heights. Reverend Abernathy led the service and talked about faith, loss, and how important it is to find peace even when things look the worst. Some people, like Ruth Patterson and Elizabeth Morrow, had their own funerals. Ruth was buried near the farm where she lived her last years in Blount County. Elizabeth was laid to rest in Old Cemetery in County, which is also where her relatives were buried. At each funeral, the goodbye was late, and the closing was too late to be real. Comfort, but it was still important. Something strange began to happen at this time. From different parts of East Tennessee and nearby states, reports of other disappearances started to come in. In the last 15 years, a number of women have gone missing in similar ways. These cases have never been solved and have often not even been fairly investigated. Sheriff Hartley started getting letters from police in other counties wondering if Silas Garrick was linked to these other cases. Hartley made it. An in-depth file with all of this data. There were scary links between at least 7 other cases. Sudden disappearances of women living alone in rural places with little or no evidence left behind. Some of these cases went back to 1907, which means Garrick may have been committing these crimes for almost 20 years. It was hard to imagine how bad the tragedy could get. During one of his last visits, I gave this knowledge to Garrick. He showed him the names of the missing women described, told Garrick about each case, and asked if he knew of any of them. Garrick heard in silence, his eyes fixed on something outside the cell walls. He barely spoke after a long pause. He talked about many holes in the mountains, secret places he had known since he was a child. He said, feed the mountains because they were hungry. These words came from a man whose mind had broken into pieces that could not be put back together. Ashwood, the prosecutor, thought about delaying the execution so that these other cases could be looked into more. The families of the 3 proven victims, on the other hand, pushed for the sentence to go through as planned. According to them, any more delays would only make things worse for everyone. Ashwood reluctantly agreed, but he promised that the investigation into the other people who went missing would go on even after Garrick died. In January 1923, just before he was to be put to death, Garrick got one last surprise visitor. Margaret Crowder had gone from Gatlinburg to Nashville in order to go see him. Not even Hartley knew about her plans. She hadn't told anyone. She just went to the jail one cold morning and asked if she could talk to the man who killed her sister. The guards were unsure, but Margaret was adamant. Months had passed while she tried to make peace, forgive, and move on. But she knew she couldn't do any of those things until she finally looked Silas Garrick in the eye and asked the questions that kept her up at night. The guards. They finally agreed, but stayed close the whole time. Margaret sat in a chair outside the bars of her cell. Garrick lay on his cot and looked up at the stained, wet ceiling. At first, she talked about Anna's life, not her death. It was told to him that Anna loved to watch birds in the spring mornings, take very good care of her veggie garden, and read books by candlelight on cold winter nights. Garrick needed to know that Anna was a real person with hopes and dreams, and a life worth living. Gary didn't move or show that he was paying attention. Margaret kept talking, but her voice started to shake from holding back her feelings. She talked about Anna's marriage to Thomas and how happy they were together, even though they were poor. She also talked about how Thomas's death from the Spanish flu had broken Anna's heart, but not her spirit. She talked about how Anna had chosen to stay in her cabin, not because she was stubborn, but because it was where all of her loved ones had died. That's when Garrick finally moved. He slowly got off the cot and looked at Margaret for the first time. He usually had empty, faraway eyes, but these ones seemed to hold something different. There was a chance that it was regret or just confusion. It was not possible to be sure. He opened his mouth to talk, then paused. Finally, he mumbled something that Margaret would never forget. Garrick said in that deep voice, "She talked about him." She talked about her husband in the caves. Thomas was his name. He agreed to come, she said, for her. He stopped and slowly blinked his eyes. It baffled me why she couldn't tell I was trying to assist her. It was my goal to keep her company. That mountain range is so lonely. Margaret got queasy in her throat. She couldn't stand the thought of Anna, scared and alone in that dark cave, calling out to her dead husband and waiting for help that would never come. She knew this might be her only chance to understand even a little, so she forced herself to keep listening. What had happened to her sister in the last few days of her life? Garrick went on talking, his words coming out in pieces that don't fit together. He said Anna was stronger than the others and that she had held out longer. He said she had screamed and begged at first, but then had become quiet and only prayed softly. Garrick told her he would bring food and water to the cave, leave them at the entrance, and then leave. He hoped she would stop being afraid of him and accept her position. She didn't stop, though. "When I came back," he whispered to her, and she lay there as if she were asleep. That chain she always wore was still in her hand. I believed she was only tired, but as I got closer I saw that she was no longer breathing. He slowly shook his head. That wasn't what I wanted. My only wish was to have someone stay with me and enjoy the mountains with me. Margaret shut her eyes, and tears ran quietly down her face. Her urge to scream and attack the man through the bars was strong. She wanted to make him feel even less pain than he was in. caused. But there was another part of her that was sad and worn out and couldn't understand it. Silas Garrick was a monster, but he was also a person who was so broken and lost that it was hard to tell who he was. She asked, but it was hard to hear, if he had meant to hurt Anna, if he had hurt her in any way besides the fear of being held captive. He shook his head and looked at her with those empty eyes. He told them he had never hit them and that he had just kept in the caves, ready to go. He waits for something he doesn't seem to know. Maybe they were waiting for something impossible to happen, for a man who had forgotten how to be human to make them want to be with him. Marge got up to leave. She looked at Garrick one last time before she left. She said, "My sister was too good for this world," her voice steady even though she was crying. "You took away the rest of her life. I hope the next part brings you peace, not because you deserve it, but because Anna would have wanted it. She believed in forgiveness, even when I don't." Garrick didn't answer. He just stared at Margaret as she walked away, her footsteps echoing in the cold prison hallway. It was the last time anyone from the victims' families spoke directly to him. Silas Garrick was scheduled to be executed at 6 a.m. on January 15, 1923. Reverend Abernathy spent the night before reading Psalms and praying with him. Garrick listened. He always stayed quiet, but in the hours before dawn, he started to talk more freely than he had in months. Not about the crime itself, but about his life, about how lonely he had been since childhood and how the mountains were the only place where he felt truly alive. When the guards came to get him at dawn, he walked calmly to the room where the gallows had been set up. As required by law, there were only a few officials and official witnesses there. No one from the public was there to watch. The executioner, a professional from out of state, did his job quietly and quickly. Silas Garrick's body was buried in an unmarked section of the prison cemetery, and there was no ceremony or mourning. No one claimed the things he had left behind, and the cabin where he was captured stayed empty in the mountains until it fell apart from the weight of time and weather. The caves where he kept his victims were sealed with stone and wood, turning them into permanent tombs for memories that no one could erase. In the years after Silas Garrick was put to death, the mountain communities of East Tennessee went through big changes. The case showed weaknesses that many people had been ignoring, like the dangers hiding in the shadows of dense forests and remote valleys. Women who lived alone on remote properties started to organize, making support networks where neighbors checked in on each other often. Men from the communities also started making more frequent rounds of the more remote areas. Not because most people didn't trust each other, but because everyone felt more responsible for each other. Margaret Crowder never went back to Gatlinburg. The mountains that had been her home became constant reminders of her unbearable loss. She moved to Knoxville and got a job teaching at an elementary school. She spent the rest of her life teaching, finding meaning in shaping young minds and building futures that Anna would never see. Margaret never got married and never had children of her own, but she had dozens of students over the years. People looked up to her as a second mother because she always had time to listen and give good, kind advice. She took care of Anna's land for another 5 years before selling it to a young family who didn't know about its dark past. Margaret only asked that they take good care of it and plant flowers in the spring, like Anna always did. The cabin was eventually torn down and replaced by a bigger house, and the new generations who lived there didn't know about the woman who had died. Hartley fought for her right to live there in peace for another 12 years. The Garrick case changed his career in ways he hadn't planned. He became famous across the state as the man who caught the ghost of Appalachia, but this didn't make him feel better. Hartley carried the weight of lost months, of leads he could have followed more quickly, and of women he could have saved if he had connected the dots sooner. He retired in 1935 and spent his last years fishing the same streams. There were sporadic investigations into other disappearances that might have been connected to Garrick for years. Several expeditions were sent to explore remote mountain caves in search of more victims, and some bodies were found. In 1924, the bodies of 2 unidentified women were found in a deep cave in Wake County, and in 1926 more bodies were found near the North Carolina border. Each discovery opened old wounds and confirmed dark suspicions about thee. Many questions were still unanswered, and the exact number of victims was never known for sure. Some researchers thought that Silas Garrick might have disappeared as many as 10 or 12 women over the course of 20 years, while others said that this number was too high and that not all the disappearances in the mountains could be linked to one man. The whole truth died with Garrick that cold January morning, along with the secrets that he kept. Reverend Joshua Abnathy continued his traveling ministry in the mountains, but the ordeal had changed him deeply. He had gone into Garrick's cell believing that any soul could be saved and that the divine word had the power to reach even the darkest hearts. He came out of that experience with his faith intact, but his view of people had been permanently changed. He began to preach more about compassion and community vigilance, about how important it was not to leave those living on the edges of society. Because being alone could change people into things that couldn't be recognized, Abernathy wrote a lot about his conversations with Garrick. This record would be studied for decades by people who want to understand the minds of men who commit such horrible crimes. His writings showed a man who was trying to figure out how to reconcile his faith in a loving God with the existence of such logical suffering. He never found answers that were completely satisfactory, but he kept looking until he died in 1942. The families of Ruth Patterson and Elizabeth Morrow went in the same direction Margaret did. They looked for closure wherever they could find it and found new purpose in the ashes of past tragedies. Ruth's sister became an advocate for women's rights and worked to make laws that better protected people living in remote rural areas. Elizabeth's brother became a police officer and became sheriff in his own county, determined to make sure no other family would have to go through what he had. Eventually, newspapers stopped publishing the stories. People were talking about Silas Garrick stories while new crimes and tragedies were happening. The Great Depression hit the country, making things hard so that events from the previous years seemed far away and not important to the daily struggles for survival. The Appalachians, which had been the site of so much horror, continued to be beautiful, not caring about the small human tragedies happening in their shadows. But in small towns, the memory lingered. Mothers told their children stories about Silas Garrick. Daughters were told scary stories about predators that lived in the mountains and how important it was to trust your gut when something didn't seem right. Grandmothers told stories about the bad old days when a predator stalked the mountains, preying on women like foxes stalk chickens at night. The stories changed over time and became legends, but the core was still true. Evil lived in these mountains and was real and scary. In 1934, the federal government started putting together what would become the National Park Service. Families who had lived in the mountains for generations were moved, and their homes and farms were incorporated into the land, which would remain naturally occurring forever. Many of the caves where Garrick had held his victims became part of this park, and were only accessible by difficult trails that not many people dared to explore. Over the years, hikers would sometimes come across evidence of the dark past, like a pile of stones that looked like it had been put together by humans. Some of these finds led nowhere, but others led to new investigations and new attempts to fully map the area that Garrick had ruled for so long. Margaret Crowder lived until 1968, when she was 79 years old. In her last days in a Knoxville hospital, she asked the granddaughter of a close friend to visit her. Margaret had kept all of Anna's letters, photos, and diary that had been returned after the trial. In her will, she gave them to the granddaughter. She only wanted Anna's story to be remembered for how strong and honorable she was, not for how it ended. "My sister loved those mountains," Margaret said, her voice weak but clear. "She chose to live there, even knowing the risks, because she valued freedom over security. It really shouldn't have killed her. She should stay in that cabin as she aged and watch the seasons change from her windows. She should also keep writing about birds and flowers in her notebooks. The simple beauty of living in the country. Not only did Silas Garrick steal years, he also stole chances. She could have read books, made friends, and seen beautiful sunsets, but he took them all away." Margaret stopped and took a deep breath. "He did not steal your memory, though. We still loved each other, talked, and laughed together. He didn't take those things away. I've thought about those things all these years. Now I give them to you. Tell her story, but do it in her own words. Really was, and not just as a victim. She was a whole, wonderful woman who lived bravely until the end." Appalachia has a dark history that includes the stories of Anna Crowder, Ruth Patterson, and Elizabeth Morrow. Many books have been written about the case over the years, all of which try to explain not only what happened, but also why it happened. Psychologists have looked at Garrick as an example of someone who was so alone that their mental health completely broke down. Sociologists have looked at the circumstances that made it possible for him to work without being caught for so long. Historians have put the events in the chaotic 1920s, a time when rural America was changing quickly and a justice system that was still very basic let many people slip through the cracks. A lot has changed in the Tennessee mountains since that terrible fall of 1921. They are still beautiful, strange, and not interested in people's problems. On the trails and national parks, tourists walk and enjoy the beautiful views and fresh air, not aware of the terrible things that happened there a long time ago. A guide might sometimes talk about old crimes and disappearances, but they sound far away, almost mythical, and hard to connect with the quiet present. But for people who know the whole story and have read the documents and accounts, the mountains have never lost their sad side. Every dark cave could have been a place of pain. Any track that was forgotten could have led to a deadly surprise. Mountains. Keep lies for as long as you can. Plus, not all of these secrets have been told. The cases of Anna Crowder and Silas Garrick's other victims make us think about uncomfortable facts about being weak, being alone, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. It makes us remember that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're just broken guys who have lost their way back to being human. It also makes us think about how important community and care for, of keeping each other company and not letting anyone get so alone that they can't be seen. The stories of these women should not be told for laughs, but as accounts of real lives that were cut short wrongly. Anna Crowder loved and lost people, had hopes and fears. Ruth Patterson was rebuilding her life after her husband died when she was taken. Lizzie Morrow had a rose yard and loved music. They were more than just victims. They were whole people. Their lives deserve more than being shown the worst parts of their lives. If this story moved you or made you think about bravery, loss, or how short life is, please consider subscribing to our channel. Stories like this one are something we do all the time. They are cases that should be remembered and puzzles that keep happening. Leave a comment with your ideas, and if you found the content interesting, click the like button. Well, always remember these times together, not because of the tragedy itself, but because of what it teaches us about people, justice, and how important it is to never forget those who have died. The Appalachians are still there, old and patient, keeping their story safe in 1,000 caves that are hard to find, so that Anna, Ruth, and Elizabeth are not forgotten, and that their lives meant more than their deaths. We are still here telling their tales. Until the next trip through the dark places of